This is Vicki Heck interviewing Barbara Spindell for a King County Library System oral history project detailing the history of Newport Way Library and the Newport Way Library Association. Today is September 6th, 2017. We are at Newport Way Library in Bellevue, Washington. This interview is recorded on an iPhone 6S using an app called Recorder Plus. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly set the stage for Newport Way Library by mentioning it is part of King County Library System, also known as KCLS. In the 1940s, the population of King County was approximately 500,000. In 1942, voters established the King County Rural Library District to provide library services to people in rural areas with no easy access to city libraries. Today, KCLS serves over 48 communities and a population of over 2 million within Washington State's King County. So we're here to discuss the history of Newport Way Library and the Newport Way Library Association. Barbara, would you please introduce yourself and tell me generally what is the purpose of Newport Way Library Association today?
Hi, Vicki. I'm Barbara Spindell. I'm currently president of the Newport Way Library Association. And the purpose of the library today is to provide support and funding for the library, the librarians, the staff, as they strive to provide this community with programming, books, and information that's going to make their lives better. So we serve as a supplemental source both for financial aid in extra programs and also in a little extra manpower sometimes, going to events like Storyfest and the Global Reading Challenge, where there aren't always enough library staff to go, and we come and help with the kids. And so that's basically what we do. We provide funds and we provide support to make this what we think is the best library in the system.
Yes, and one of my recent favorite programs that the NWLA helped support was our maker weekends that we've had here.
Oh, that was really super. I mean, the whole library was taken up with events, and we had adults crocheting hats and children making robotic little helicopters, and the whole community turned out. And there were so many stations that it was an opportunity for those of us in the Library Association to interact and help, and so much joy was involved and so much work was involved with that event. But it was a huge success, so thanks for remembering that, because that was fun.
All right, now we'll get to the meat of the topic and talk about the history of the Newport Way Library Association. How did the group even come about?
In 1964, there was no library in this community. As you said, the King County Library System was a rural library system, and these communities were growing, but there was none here. And Leif Bjorseth was a member of the Eastgate Community Association, and he went to the president, Hal Myers, and he said, you know, Hal, I think it's time for us to have a library in this area. We've grown big enough, and we're kind of far from any source of library materials. And Hal, being a good president, I guess, turned to Leif and said, well, I think that's a good idea, and you can chair the committee to investigate having a library in the Eastgate community. And Leif did that. He went out and he reached out to the community. He got some donations. He beat the drum to get people interested and excited about bringing a library to this area. And in March of 1966, Hal Myers spoke with the King County Library System and came back to the community and said that the library system said yes, you know, they would be interested. They think it's a good idea to have a library in this area, but the library service had no money for the construction of libraries. If the community could provide a suitable building, the county would provide the books and would provide the staff. So this was the kickoff for an actual library here. So the community got together, and in August of '66, they held a large meeting that involved 16 PTAs, community clubs, service organizations, and they reported on what the library committee of the Eastgate Community Club had achieved. They had gone out and researched finding a building. They had looked into renting space in a store down near where the Albertsons is currently located, in a shopping area, and they felt that that would just be too small. They looked into buying a former barracks that was located at the top of Cougar Mountain on the Nike site during the war, and they thought that that might be a feasible solution, that they could buy that building, I think, and move it to a site, but they would need to acquire some land. So at that point, they felt it was the right time to form a formal group to research getting the funding for a library building and library property, because the construction was on the burden of getting a library building was on the community. So in 1966, they formally incorporated the Newport Way Library Association, and its mission at that time was to bring a library to this community. It turned out that moving, they needed land, and a community member stepped forward, Charles Hutchins, and he donated over an acre of land in a location that's actually not very far from where the current library sits. It's right near where the Tyee School is. And he donated this property with the sole purpose of building a library there. So that was step one. They had that. Then they had to think about costs of construction. They were going to move the Nike site. And in order to do that, they explored the possibilities, the funding, and it was going to turn out to be quite expensive to move it and to reinforce it and to get everything they needed. So this brought us into 1966, and at that time, the director of the library system, Herb Muchler, came to the association and said, the time is right now. This, for the first time, we're going to go out and ask the communities in the KCLS system to vote for a $6 million bond to build libraries in this area. Previous to this, the libraries were all small, more kind of storefront or placed in other buildings, like in local churches, had a couple of rooms that were set out to be the library. So he was going to ask for this $6 million, and that would help build a library in this area. But and the good news was there was a federal matching grant fund that would have provided practically another $6 million, so there would have been $12 million to build libraries, and we in this community would be able to take advantage of that. In order to do that, the land that we had to pass federal muster, because they were not going to they were not going to grant money unless truly a library would survive. And so it had to pass muster from the Army Engineering Corps. And when the Corps came in and they inspected the property, they wouldn't pass it because of flood issues. And so they would not okay it to the government to fund a library here when it stood possibility of being flooded out. And so that was a real downer for the community, for the group. They'd had the property, and a big disappointment. There also turned out to be an easement, a county easement that went right through the middle of the property, where the county could build a road, and roads were needed. This was a growing community, and they needed a road to connect to Newport Way from Allen Road. And there were many, many meetings where the community went to city council and tried to say that this is not a good spot to build a road, you should build the road somewhere else. But the short story is that the property was not going to work out. And Herb Muchler was very instrumental in talking with the Aldersgate Methodist Church, which is in the neighborhood of the property that we had. Aldersgate had a large swath of property, and they eventually agreed to sell over an acre of land to the library system and have the library build on that land, which would abut Aldersgate property. And that transaction actually did occur, but before it could occur, there was the library bought. Actually, they didn't buy it. Newport Way Library Association owned this Hutchins property, which was unacceptable as a library. They deeded by gift that property to the King County Library System, and I actually, when I was going through the history documents, found that deed. They gave the deed to the library system with the proviso that whatever funds were acquired through sale of the property would go into a gift fund that would be used for the support of the Newport Way Library when it came into existence. And that's where the funds showed up when I was treasurer. I wondered, where did this library system, where did the Newport Way Library have the ability to generate over $30,000 in a gift fund? And it turned out that was the endowment that the Library Association provided that future library through their hard work. They took the Hutchins property they worked very hard to get that donation, and when it didn't work out, that property was sold with the help of King County Library System, and they were kind enough to take those funds and set them aside for use by this library. And so it's like a fairy tale in a sense, that the hard work of the community did bear incredible fruit that we still benefit from today. So started in 66. In 1970, the library was built, and when it was built, the mission of the Newport Way Library Association had to change slightly. They'd accomplished what they set out to do, and their mission then became supporting that library, bringing programs to that library. They did a lot more at that time than is possible today when the library system is so much bigger. But when it was working on that level, they felt it was their mission to go out and find programs that would educate the community, that would entertain the community, that would provide the community with learning opportunities. And they did that in a big way. They really did, in a very big way. So they had book sales to generate funds, and their very first book sale they held in Bellevue Square, which, for those of us now who know what Bellevue Square is, it's hard to imagine a local library being able to hold their book sale, and they generated something like $200 or $300. It wasn't a big amount of money, but I think it's important to note that when the library was first built, the association and the community took on the burden of paying for lots of parts of that library. They paid for the upkeep outside, they paid for some of the janitorial services, they paid for some of the programs, and so they were a fundamental part of what made this library what it is today.
So you have the land now, and it's time to build the library. How involved was the Newport Way Library Association in the actual building of the library?
Well, I think it's amazing how involved they were. As I read through the minutes, and I think it's wonderful that the system in general let them take a lead. They actually interviewed the architects for the building of this library, and they picked Fred Bassetti to be the architect. They presented their findings to the library system, and Fred Bassetti was chosen as the architect. They picked a sculptor, Steve Beyer, who did some very unique work in the brickwork inside the building. There are unique little sculptures throughout, little surprises when you walk through the building, some carved into the brickwork and some that are added on. So they did that, and they also through the years have commissioned artwork. We were very fortunate that one of the original members of the Library Association, Jervis Reed, was an art professor at the University of Washington, and so he was intimately tied into the art community and was instrumental in knowing artists like Steve Beyer and also Harold Balls. I'm trying to think of the name of the sculptor artist who did the tile sculpture in front of the library, which is very, very unique. That was a commissioned work. It was after the library was originally built, but it's very specific to this library, and it has tiles, Newport Way and community, and is a focal point for the library. And when the library was remodeled and all but the walls were removed, KCLS was very careful to take that sculpture down off the wall. Howard Belize is his name. It's just popped into my head. They took that off the wall, they moved it off site to keep it safe and brought it back. So yes, it's a good question, Vicki. The Library Association was very much a part of the actual building of the library. What else?
You mentioned some of the beautiful, unique art pieces, like the brickwork incorporated into the walls, actual walls of the library, as well as the mosaic that you mentioned. What are some of your favorite projects the Newport Way Library Association has accomplished over the years?
Well, I guess, we covered the initial ones, and I think the mosaic, the Beyer sculpture, and the actual design of the building, which I think is, at the time, it's been changed over the years, but the basic design is very unique. It sits in this piece of land just so comfortably, and it's so inviting that that was a very special contribution. I'm very proud, I think, when you look back, one of the programs that we've had at this library, Opera Previews, were started by the Library Association. One of our board members, Betsy Fitzgerald, was an opera buff and knew Norm Hollingshead, who is very, very knowledgeable. Kind of lives and breathes and eats opera, and she invited him to come and do a preview of a production that was going to take place at the Seattle Opera, and he did that, and he came to our library 5 times a year, in parallel with the productions that were put on by Seattle Opera, and presented a preview. He played the piano, he played records, he brought in singers, and those were very popular events, and they were so popular that KCLS said, this is really a good thing to provide for libraries, and Norm branched out, quote, in more ways than one. He went to many of the branches of the library, turned it into a small business for himself, but it's become a looked forward to event all throughout the year at many of our King County libraries, and we're very proud that we were the first ones and we were instrumental in starting that program up. I think another program that we did that was quite unique was called Book Fest, and that was a program that my friend Jan Lonergan, who was my next door neighbor, she was a writer, and so she was very much connected to the writing community, and she felt it would be great fun and very popular if we could bring some authors directly to the library, have people meet some of their favorite authors, have the ability to buy books that they would sign for them, and perhaps have those authors tell us a little bit about how you launch a successful writing career, how you publish, things that people are very interested in, especially potential writers. And so we would have over 20 authors come. We would set up tables on a 2-day event for them at the library, Saturday and Sunday. The whole main part of the library would be devoted to these authors. They each sat at a table. You could sit down with them, talk to them. They had their books, so it was a win-win situation. We got to directly interact with these authors, and they got to sell some books. We worked with University Bookstore, who provided the books to us and gave the association a percentage of the sales. So we actually raised funds and also brought an event that was wildly successful. And we did that for about 5 years. We're very proud to be able to get to know people like Eric Larson, who has launched a very interesting career as a nonfiction author. And I remember to this day sitting in a talk he gave, and he's explaining that he liked nonfiction. He liked to explore what had gone on and facts, but that you had to find something, you had to find a little twist to get people interested enough that they would read your books. And he has had great success in Devil in White City and several other books that were fun to read and interesting to read. We had children's authors like Gloria and Ted Rand, who came year after year bringing their books. They illustrated and wrote children's books, and they were very successful. So we were proud to do that. Eventually, once again, it was such a good idea that the system took it up heartily and started having authors come, and we realized that we weren't getting as many people coming because they had already met Ted and Gloria at Mercer Island Library, and it wasn't as unique as it started to be, but we were very proud of that. We worked very hard to get authors who came from Oregon, they came from Bainbridge, people hosted parties for them. It was really a fun event, so that was really nice. And I guess I would also say that the sculpture garden that we have outside the library is something we're very proud of. Originally, when the library was built back in 1970, this was a kind of borderline wetland area. And to this day, you can't really extend the footprint of our building because of the wetland issue. And outside, we used to call it Lake Bellevue because it would flood. And over the years, KCLS did do some drainage work and got that to go away. But after I had been on a trip to England and I had visited Barbara Hepworth's sculpture garden, I came back entranced, and I sat at a library board meeting and I said, don't you think it would be really great if we could, get some sculptures and do a little landscaping and make the entrance to the library a lot more beautiful than it is now, because it really wasn't very beautiful at that time. It was like a recovering swamp. But I still laugh about it because Betsy Fitzgerald, I mentioned before, was also a landscape architect, and she looked at me, and I guess maybe she was getting older and a little more pessimistic, and she just looked at me and said, "I don't think so, Barbara." And of course I do rise to a challenge. And so I didn't let it go, and I went and talked with people in the community and met some very nice people in the arts community who arranged to have us have loans of sculpture that could be installed outside. And I went to KCLS and talked with the director then, Bill Potasic, who was very supportive and said, well, if you can get these sculptures, we will landscape, and KCLS will help you with the installation. And we did it. And not only did we get those sculptures on loan, the association set aside funds and purchased several of those that stand as the basis of the library. We currently have some permanent loan sculptures out there. We have purchased memorial benches for Herb Muchler, who I mentioned to you before, was instrumental in working with the Library Association to bring a library to the area. And we have a bench out in the children's area garden in memory of Leif Bjorseth, who was our first president and who served so faithfully through so many years. I mean, Leif continued on the board into his 90s and finally retired when he was about 91, I think. And he said to me, Barbara, I sit at the meetings, but I can't do much because I don't hear that well. And so I think it's time for me to step down. So it's truly something I'm proud of, that we acknowledge the contribution of those founding members. Leif represents that with his bench, and I think Herb represents the support we got from the KCLS Foundation. So it's a wonderful blending that I'm happy to be able to tell somebody about, so that when you look at those, when you walk through the garden, you know that it's important. And that garden really is a welcome retreat spot for people. I watch people go out there in the summertime and sit on those benches, have their lunch, children read books. So I think that's a great contribution that we made.
Barbara, it's been a wonderful sum up of the history of the Newport Way Library Association and the Newport Way Library. Thank you so much.
Oh.
In closing, I'm just curious if you have any last comments or stories about either the Newport Way Library Association or Newport Way Library that you'd like to share?
I think just in summing up, I think the Library Association has served this library well and continues to serve it, and it's because of a genuine love of libraries and what they can do for a community. And over the course of the years, we've seen this community change. We don't have the same people living here. We have different socioeconomic groups, we have different ethnic groups, but it has served, I think, as a rock solid foundation and source of knowledge, information, entertainment, and every community needs a library. And I go back to what we see as the mission of the library, and the mission of this association is just to promote libraries as the heart of a community.
Thank you, Barbara.
You're welcome.